right, I'm back and ready to talk about human papillomavirus. You may not only have heard of it as genital warts, but you might have heard of it referred to as HPV. So, symptoms of HPV. Well, I want you to brace yourself because I'm going to show you some symptoms of HPV, which involve people's genitals or mouths or anuses with warts. So, get ready. All right, you better be ready. Here we go. So here's a penis that has genital warts, human papillomavirus. And to have this kind of outbreak, you have a person whose body is not able to fight off this virus very well. For most people, we'll see a small, one or two warts, something like that. A person who's having difficulty fighting it off will show this kind of buildup of lots of warts all in, one area. In really, out of control cases where the person's immune system isn't fighting it off very well, you might see a person who has human papillomavirus all over their body. And, it's basically this growth that can go unchecked if the body can't fight it off. So the trick is nobody knows how they would respond when exposed to this virus. You don't know if you're one of the people who will be able to clear it. Here we have genital warts on the labia, even on the labia minora. You can see there in the opening of the vagina, you can see a wart there in the labia minora, let alone out on the labia majora. So we have a case where, again, the person's having difficulty fighting off this infection. Here's an anus with genital warts on it, and here's a mouth with human papillomavirus growing in its mouth, in the mouth, on the roof of the mouth. So this is the main symptom, is that you're going to have these growths, and all warts on your body are caused by human papillomavirus. It's just that there are lots of different strains, and some of the strains prefer living in the moist, warm areas of the genitals, the rectum, the mouth, and like that. So transmission, it's going to occur through viral shedding. So coming in contact with the virus is how you transmit the virus, right? So you might say to yourself, well, I mean, if I saw genitals or a mouth that looked like this, I would probably not engage in sexual contact with a person who had these on them. But a lot of times they're not this visible. A lot of times the virus is being shed through the epithelial cells without a really noticeable wart present. So it can be kind of risky. You don't really know for sure, but absolutely, a genital inspection is not a bad idea, or, a mouth inspection. Sometimes people will get growths on their mouth and they think, oh gosh, it might be cancer. I don't want to ask my doctor about it. And it turns out it's human papillomavirus. And the treatment is going to be, I forgot to talk about prevention before I talk about treatment. So hold on to that thought, prevention. We now have a vaccine available, and probably a lot of you have had the vaccine. It's marketed under the name Gardasil. I think it's still under patent, but maybe there's other names for it that are available. So the key thing is the vaccine needs to be administered prior to the person becoming sexually active. So that's why it's introduced young. A lot of people think that it's too young to be telling 11 and 12-year-olds that they need to take a vaccine to prevent a sexually transmitted infection. But it's really important that we have the treatment occur prior to any kind of sexual contact that might actually conduct that actually might transmit that virus to the recipient. So taking a vaccine. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the vaccine after I mention that the major treatment, if you get infected, is really just chronic removal, right? Like that's the way that you handle it. And so these pictures that you're looking at are probably people who have come to the doctor to have them removed, and the doctor took a picture of it, and then they're going to remove the warts. And so sometimes they'll stay on for a while, and sometimes they grow really fast. So it varies by individuals. The key thing that really promoted, the research into a vaccine for this is once they realized that there was a connection between human papillomavirus and cervical cancer in particular. They found that almost every person who had cervical cancer had also had genital warts. And so they started putting it together. And for a long time, people were really struggling with how there could be a link between genital warts and cervical cancer, because the assumption was that cancer was strictly a gene mutation issue. And now more and more types of cancer have been being tied to viral infections of different sorts. And so once they put that together, they realized if we can prevent a person from getting human papillomavirus, we can prevent them almost entirely from getting cervical cancer. I mentioned earlier that there are lots of different strains of human papillomavirus. The Gardasil type of vaccine doesn't protect against all of the strains that could potentially cause cervical cancer, but it does protect against the biggest, most common ones. So I wanted to show you from the CDC in 2013, we see this number of visits to the doctor that resulted in a diagnosis of human papillomavirus. And you can see that the numbers have been going up since 1966. Gardasil was approved in 41 states in 2008. And so the prediction has been that we should be seeing a reduction as the kids who got those shots in 2008 and beyond become adults. We should be seeing a reduction in this. But just like with herpes, genital warts is one of those illnesses that because you don't really ever get rid of it, you accumulate it. And so as people get older, they can still catch genital warts. At first, Gardasil was only administered to people who were 25 and under. Then it was like 26 and under. And then now they're starting to say, well, if you haven't had sex yet, you're eligible for Gardasil. So they're administering it to older, but still, sexually inexperienced people, because they're realizing that it does have protective abilities for everybody. They used to think, well, you got to get it when you're young, but now they're administering it even if you are over 25. So hopefully we'll be seeing that number going down. All right, I'm just going to introduce HIV. This is going to take a little bit of time, so I'll probably do this across a couple of different segments. So let's just kind of introduce human immunodeficiency virus. It is what we call a retrovirus. So what that means is that the virus enters the body and it goes into the cell, whichever type of cell the retrovirus likes to inhabit. It turns out that HIV likes to inhabit our immune system cells. So it goes into the cell, it kicks out that cell's RNA, and it instead uses that cell as its own little factory for making more of itself. And then as a new HIV is made, it gets sent out of the cell to go, infiltrate another human body cell and start making it its own little factory, and that's how it builds up. So retroviruses mean that they go inside your own cells, and start replicating themselves from inside of your own cell. Now, the way that human immunodeficiency virus works, see that immunodeficiency thing? What it does is it interferes with the functioning of the immune system. Now, the sweet spot for your immune system is that you've got enough immunity so that you can fight off infection, but not so much immunity that you start attacking your own body and developing autoimmunity. So you want to be right in that sweet spot where you can fight off infection without fighting your own systems. What happens with HIV is that ultimately the immune system starts to be overwhelmed by HIV little factories that are making itself. And so the immune system can't respond to normal infections, things that normally it should be able to fight off really easily. So you see these, what they call opportunistic infections, like Kaposi sarcoma. That mark on that nose it looks like a bruise, but it's actually a disease called Kaposi sarcoma. That in an average person with a healthy immune system, they would fight it off and not even know they ever had it. But a person who's got a compromised immune system will display these, bruise-like marks, and that's a sign that they've got a compromised immune system. Now, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is a specific type of pneumonia that's really rare, causes cysts in the lungs, really uncommon, and most people who are exposed to it fight it off and don't have any negative effect from it. But if you contract this and show big effects, we know that the immune system's not working very well. So these are really common opportunistic infections that go along with HIV. So just to recap, the retrovirus enters your bodily cells, kicks out your own RNA, and hides inside your cells. So it's got its little house in there, and it kicks out replications of itself that then themselves go and find another one of your cells to commandeer and make themselves replicate themselves inside of you. Now, a lot of viruses work like this. The flu is a retrovirus. It just happens to target your lungs and like that. COVID-19 is a retrovirus. It occupies your own cells and replicates itself from inside your cells. So these are retroviruses take lots of different forms. They're very similar to each other, the way that they function. And what makes them all difficult is that they hide inside of your own cells. So once they've infected you, it's difficult to get any kind of external medication or something like that that will kill them inside your cell, right? We can kill them in your bloodstream, but as soon as whatever you put into your bloodstream to kill them goes away, they're still replicating from inside of you. And so it's really, really intractable. Now, I'm going to give you guys fair warning that, I have a very close tie to HIV and AIDS because my uncle, William James Singer, died in 1994 of AIDS. He and his boyfriend, his partner, Glenn died a little bit later. My uncle had been one of the first people to survive Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is now considered a very survivable type of cancer that tends to hit young people. And my uncle was in college and had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he was in a test trial of a treatment for Hodgkin's that out of the 6 cases, he was the only one who survived the treatment. And it went into complete remission, and he lived, a very happy and full life until he contracted HIV. And, he was very early in the epidemic. And so he probably caught it 10 years before he ultimately died of it. But because he was a cancer survivor and had already had, certain kinds of treatments, he wasn't a candidate for a lot of the experimental treatments that were being tried back in the early 90s. And Glenn was. And so Glenn lived another 3 or 4 years after my uncle died. And unfortunately, the treatments blinded him and other kinds of things. They were really hard, but they did extend his life. But so I just wanted to be, clear that I have, personal experience with the early days of the HIV, what ultimately became a pandemic. And a lot of the misinformation and stuff like that went on during this time. And so I know that sometimes students hear me talking and they interpret me through a particular lens of their own making. And so I don't want you to think that I'm conveying this information I'm going to convey to you through anything else except for, a lot of compassion and a lot of experience with what exactly was going on, especially back in the, 80s and 90s. So let's go through some of those backgrounds and the hypotheses about where this came from. I'm making this lecture in late October of 2020, and that's a really hot topic right now. Where did this virus come from is a really hot topic. Believe me, it was a huge thing and continues to be one to this day regarding the origins of HIV. What we now know looking back on things is that probably sometime in the 1800s, SIV, which is simian immunodeficiency virus, transferred to humans. We think it probably made that jump from a chimpanzee to a hunter of a chimpanzee. It's hard for us to think about, but there are cultures in Africa that consume chimpanzees. And it's possible that they got it through eating, but more than likely the hunter got bitten or the hunter cut themselves during the butchering process and the chimpanzee's blood entered that way. It's hard to say exactly, but there are a lot of mechanisms that would make a lot of sense that have to do with the hunting process. So it is thought to have jumped to humans sometime in the 1800s. By 1920, looking back now, researchers are pretty confident that a case that was studied in 1920 in the Congo probably had HIV. Probably that's what caused that death. But that's all looking back. I mean, we have a very confirmed case from the 1950s in the Congo area also, where they actually saved tissue from that person. And now they went back and analyzed the tissue and definitely had HIV. So we think somewhere around the early 1900s, around 1920 is probably when that first case actually occurred. In the 1960s, cases started to appear in Haiti. And that's actually a pretty complex story because apparently after the Congo stopped being a colony, and it had been a colony of Belgium, which is French speaking. And so when they stopped being a colony and were trying to organize their own government and things like that, they were looking for French speakers who could help them with that process. And so professional people from Haiti who were, experts in government and international affairs and other things and spoke French went to the Congo and worked there. And when they returned from that is when they think it was introduced in Haiti. So the first Western hemisphere transmission was probably in Haiti. Now in 1981, a scientific report came out reporting on 41 cases of homosexual men, they say, who had a rare and often rapidly fatal form of cancer. They were talking about Kaposi sarcoma. And 8 of the victims died less than 24 months after the diagnosis was made. So they were like, this is weird. This rare cancer that most of us would fight off if we were exposed to it. Here we have these otherwise healthy young men. All of them were homosexual and living in San Francisco and in New York. Suddenly have this illness that we never see here in the U.S. It's a really rare thing. So in 1981, we reported our first cases of this rare disease, and scientists were trying to figure out what it was. This should all sound really haunting to you as you're sitting here in the middle of a pandemic, and there's all this misinformation going on, and all this people jumping to conclusions, and scientists really strongly trying to figure it out. The thing that scientists do is put their heads down and try and figure it out. And then everybody else is just talking about it and trying to, simplify the problem. So we get to this stigma, the developing stigma around this illness. In the US, because it first emerged among the gay population, it was called gay-related disease, or GRID. And they literally believed at that time that you had to be gay to catch it. Like it was something about being gay. So if you guys took that Kinsey Institute, sexual health survey at the very beginning of class, one of the questions was, could having anal sex cause HIV? And of course, from your perspective, 40 years after the, first cases, you would be thinking, well, of course not. How could that happen? No. But back then, they did not understand. And even scientists they're the ones who labeled the disease GRID. Among other people, sort of more like in the newspaper and things like that, they were talking about the risk factors that scientists had been pointing to. They had noticed that over the next couple of years, they started noticing, well, they had very similar cases in Haiti, right? So they went and, the CDC officials went down to Haiti and looked at these cases. They noticed that in certain hemophilia cases where the person was having to get transfusions of platelets and stuff because they have a bleeding disorder called hemophilia, some of them were developing HIV even though they weren't gay or Haitian. And they're like, well, that's weird. And they were noticing it was also popping up among heroin addicts. So this media kind of depiction of what they called the 4-H club. If you're homosexual, Haitian, hemophiliac, or heroin addict, it's a disease that gets you. right? And so a lot of the early messaging that scientists were trying to get was going past this media depiction of, there are only certain people who are at risk for this illness. In 1983, finally, it seemed like it took forever. In fact, my memory was that it was more like 1986, and so I had to look it up. It really, literally, it was 1983, which was only a couple of years after this was first identified in the U.S. French researchers discovered that there was an actual virus, they called it HIV, that was the cause of these rare cases of cancer and all these other things that we were seeing, that it had nothing to do with sexual orientation or being a hemophiliac or being Haitian. It didn't even matter if you were officially a heroin addict. These are all just modes of transmission of the illness. It wasn't that you were more vulnerable because of that, like structurally. It was because these categories of people engaged in behaviors that were more likely to lead to transmission. Like, for example, hemophiliacs had to get blood transfusions. So once they cleaned up the blood supply, then that got crossed off as a possible risk factor. They actually earned the Nobel Prize. They were awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering this virus. And, I had a student a number of years ago who said to me, why don't you talk more about like the political climate at the time of HIV and whether the government gave enough funding and other kinds of things. And part of the why I don't discuss the political stuff around this is because I'm trying to stick to the science and what we know. People's opinions are not really very relevant in the big picture. And I think if you can think about how we're all reacting right now under the COVID pandemic, and how some people say one thing and somebody else says something else, and the characterization of people who do wear masks or don't wear masks is having all sorts of other characteristics that go along with that. If you could just think about all the stuff that's going on with regard to attitudes about behaviors surrounding COVID and amplify it, 100 times, you will have an inkling of what the climate was like in the early 80s, through the 80s, I would say, into the early 90s, as we were trying to figure out how to limit the spread of this disease that is contracted through sexual contact and direct blood-to-blood contact. I think it's kind of interesting to watch a lot of the exact same messaging going on right now with COVID that had been mistakenly applied during HIV. During HIV, they were saying things like, when you have sex with one person, you're not really just having sex with that one person, you're having sex with everybody that they've ever had sex with before. And the message that these PSAs would end with was, so basically don't have sex. Now that's a really helpful message to give to humans, right? I think that's a really damaging idea, that we could tell people that the way that you can stay healthy is to never have sexual contact with anyone. Back then, we didn't understand transmission. And so there were a lot of mistaken beliefs, like you could get it from using the same phone as somebody else who, used it before you and they're HIV positive. They thought it was transmitted through the air. They thought you could get it from sitting on a toilet seat. There were all sorts of things that were said. And when I say they, I mean like the media was telling us this. The scientists very quickly drilled down on the means of transmission, very quickly. But between the falsehoods that were being told about, everything's risky, and then the judgments that were placed on people who contracted it, there was a lot of motivation for people to lie about whether they had engaged in behaviors that could have led to HIV transmission. So that actually slows us down when people won't admit that they had engaged in a behavior that they're ashamed of. It slows down the understanding of the disease. And so that was problematic. There's so much stigma tied to things. And so when I'm watching very similar things happening now with COVID, oh no, I was wearing a mask. And the truth is the person contracted it because they weren't wearing a mask, and they were having maybe they're having sex with somebody and they were kissing and doing other kinds of things, and that's how they picked it up. But they don't want to say that. There's a stigma tied to things. And so it slows us down, and scientists can't sort things out if they don't have the correct information. And so it's very similar. I think you guys are going through something that hopefully should help you to be a little bit more sympathetic to the things that people were going through back in the 80s and early 90s when we were trying to figure out how HIV is transmitted and, how we can treat it and things like that. All right. That seems like a good time to take a break. So let's come back in the next segment and we'll talk about the stages of infection.